Tonight, the moon rises over Angkor. Its pale light settles across the towers of Angkor Wat, touches the long stone causeway, and trembles upon the dark surface of the moat. Beyond the temple walls, the night gathers over forests, rice fields, villages, and silent stretches of earth where ancient roads and canals still lie beneath the landscape. At Bayon, enormous stone faces look outward from the darkness. Their expressions are calm and unreadable. They have watched centuries of rain fall across the city. They have watched roots enter the cracks between stones. Wooden houses disappear, and once busy paths fade beneath grass and soil. Around them, the sounds of the modern world grow distant. Insects call from the trees. Water moves quietly through channels first shaped by human hands long ago. To most visitors, Angkor appears to be a world of temples. There are towers rising like mountains, galleries carved with armies and gods, and long corridors where footsteps echo through the stone. These monuments are so vast that they seem to contain the whole story. But the temples were only the most durable part of a much larger city. Beyond them once stood houses, workshops, gardens, markets, ponds, roads, embankments, and fields. Most were built from wood, earth, and other materials that did not survive. What remained hidden beneath the forest and farmland was the outline of an urban world spread across an immense landscape. At its height, Angkor was sustained by water. The Khmer shaped the land around the rhythm of the monsoon. They built reservoirs large enough to resemble inland seas. They raised embankments, dug canals, redirected streams, and created countless ponds beside homes and temples. Water filled moats, fed fields, supported communities, and helped transform a seasonal landscape into the heart of a powerful kingdom. This system was more than an achievement of engineering. It was part of the order of the city itself. Water connected the labour of farmers to the authority of kings. It linked the rice field to the temple, the household pond to the great reservoir, and the yearly rains to the survival of the entire urban world. For generations, the system endured. Then the climate began to change. The rains became less reliable. Long periods of drought placed growing pressure on reservoirs, canals, and communities. When the monsoon returned, it sometimes returned with destructive force. Water that had once been stored and guided began to erode embankments, damage channels, and move through the landscape in ways the system could no longer easily control. But climate alone did not end Angkor. War placed pressure on the kingdom. Trade routes shifted. Religious life changed. Political power gradually moved south toward rivers and maritime networks. Fewer people remained to repair a system that had grown enormous, interconnected, and difficult to maintain. Angkor did not disappear in a single night. There was no final moment when every gate closed and every family left together. Instead, the city changed slowly. A canal was neglected, a field was abandoned, a household moved away, a road became quieter. One generation repaired less than the generation before, until the great urban landscape no longer worked as it once had. So how did one of the most sophisticated cities of the medieval world gradually lose control of the water that had sustained it? And what happened to the people who lived among its reservoirs, roads, and sacred towers? Tonight, we will journey beyond the temples and into the living city that once surrounded them. To understand how Angkor changed, we must first look beneath the forest, beyond the stone monuments, and into the vast hidden landscape they once ruled. For centuries, Angkor was known through its monuments. Travellers who entered the region saw towers rising above the forest, galleries covered in carvings, and long stone causeways leading toward temples of extraordinary scale. Angkor Wat alone seemed large enough to represent an entire civilization. Its walls contained armies, gods, royal processions, and scenes from sacred stories. Its moat stretched across the landscape like a dark mirror. It was easy to believe that the temples were the city, but they were not. The stone monuments were only the most visible remains of a much larger world, one that had once extended far beyond the walls of Angkor Wat and the gates of Angkor Thom. The people of the region had never completely forgotten Angkor. Local communities continued to live among the ruins, visit sacred places, and preserve traditions connected to the temples. Angkor Wat itself remained an active religious site long after the royal court had moved away. Yet to many outsiders, especially those arriving from Europe in the 19th century, the city appeared mysterious and abandoned. They saw routes wrapped around galleries, towers rising through trees, and carved faces watching from the jungle. Their accounts often described Angkor as a lost city reclaimed by nature, a place that had vanished from human memory until adventurous travellers found it again. It was a powerful image, but it was not entirely true. Angkor had not been forgotten by the Khmer people. What had been lost was a clear understanding of the scale and structure of the city that once surrounded the temples. Stone survives, wood disappears. The houses of ordinary families, the workshops of craftsmen, the shelters of labourers, and the buildings of local officials were mostly constructed from materials that could not endure centuries of rain, insects, fire, and decay. Their posts rotted, their roofs collapsed, their walls returned to the earth. Over time, the city's living neighbourhoods became almost invisible. Only the temples, bridges, reservoirs, and monumental embankments remained obvious. For generations, scholars tried to reconstruct Angkor by walking through the landscape. They mapped temple complexes, traced old roads, examined canals, and studied the Great Berets, the enormous rectangular reservoirs that still dominate parts of the region. But the forest concealed much of what had once existed. Then new methods began to change the picture. Aerial photography revealed patterns that could not easily be seen from the ground. Faint lines crossed fields, raised banks formed geometric shapes beneath vegetation. Old channels appeared where no modern waterway existed. Later, laser scanning from the air allowed researchers to look beneath the tree canopy. The technology, known as LiDAR, sent pulses of light toward the Earth and measured the time they took to return. By removing the visual cover of leaves and branches, researchers could create detailed maps of the ground below. What emerged was not simply a collection of temples. It was the outline of a vast urban landscape. Roads stretched between sacred centres. Canals divided neighbourhoods and fields. Embankments redirected water. Small ponds appeared beside areas where homes had once stood. Grids, pathways, agricultural plots, and settlement mounds spread across the land. The great temples were no longer isolated monuments in the jungle. They were central points within a living network. Angkor had been a city of stone and wood, of ritual and labour, of water and soil. Its population was not gathered inside a single dense centre surrounded by defensive walls. Instead, the urban landscape extended outward in a broad pattern of houses, fields, ponds, shrines, roads and canals. It was a city without the shape modern eyes usually expect. There were no endless streets of stone buildings. There was no single boundary beyond which the city suddenly ended. Angkor blended gradually into farmland, villages, water systems, and forest. This made it difficult to see. It also made it one of the most remarkable urban environments of the medieval world. Once the hidden landscape became visible, the mystery changed. The question was no longer simply how the Khmer had built such magnificent temples. The deeper question was how an urban world of this size had continued to live. How had water reached so many communities? How had food been produced and moved? How had labour been organised across such a wide landscape? And how had rulers maintained authority over a city whose true boundaries stretched far beyond the monuments they built? To answer those questions, we must follow the channels, because beneath the temples, beneath the roads, and beneath the power of the kings, Angkor rested upon a system that shaped almost every part of life, a kingdom built on water. To understand Angkor, we must first understand the rhythm of the land. For part of the year, the skies above Cambodia remain pale and dry. The earth hardens beneath the sun. Ponds shrink, small channels become shallow, and the fields wait beneath a haze of heat. Then the monsoon arrives. Clouds gather over the plains. Rain falls with sudden force, drumming on roofs, filling depressions in the soil, swelling streams, and spreading water across the lowlands. Within a short season, the landscape changes completely. For the people of Angkor, this cycle was both a gift and a danger. Too little rain could threaten the rice harvest. Too much could wash away embankments, flood settlements, and carry soil through channels that had taken generations to build. The challenge was not simply to find water, it was to live between extremes. The Khmer responded by shaping the landscape on an extraordinary scale. Across Angkor, they dug canals, raised banks of earth, redirected natural waterways, constructed moats, and created thousands of ponds beside homes, temples, and agricultural areas. Some channels carried water toward the city, others moved it away. Some connected large reservoirs to smaller networks, while others may have served transportation, drainage, ritual, or several purposes at once. At the centre of this system stood the Great Barrays. These enormous rectangular bodies of water were among the most impressive constructions in the medieval world. The West Barray alone extended for several kilometres, its long embankments enclosing what must once have appeared like an inland sea. From the edge, a person could look across the water and barely see the opposite bank. To build such a reservoir required far more than digging. Thousands of labourers had to move earth, raise walls, manage slopes, and connect the basin to surrounding channels. The work demanded planning across distances too large to be understood from a single point on the ground. The barrays were practical structures, but they were also part of Angkor's sacred landscape. In Khmer cosmology, temples could represent the holy mountain at the centre of the universe, while surrounding water recalled the cosmic ocean. A reservoir could store water, display royal authority, support surrounding communities, and express a vision of order all at the same time. Modern scholars still debate the precise role played by each barray. They were not necessarily simple irrigation tanks, feeding every rice field through a single, organised network. Their functions may have changed across centuries, and water may not always have moved through them in the same way. But there is little doubt that water shaped the structure of Angkor. It surrounded temples, it divided neighbourhoods, it linked settlements, it sustained household ponds and agricultural land, and it reminded everyone who lived there that the power of the kingdom was written not only in stone, but in the earth itself. For an ordinary family, the water system would not have appeared as one vast machine. It would have been experienced in smaller ways: a pond beside the house, a channel along the edge of a field, a bank of earth, that needed to be repaired before the rains, a ditch cleared of weeds and mud, a wooden bridge crossing a narrow stream, a flooded rice field reflecting the sky. Life depended on constant maintenance. Silt gathered in channels, plants took root along their banks. Heavy rain damaged edges. Dry seasons cracked the earth. Water could not simply be controlled once and then forgotten. It had to be watched. It had to be guided. It had to be negotiated year after year. This work connected households to the larger power of the kingdom. Farmers produced rice that supported temples, officials, soldiers, craftsmen, and labourers. Communities maintained local water features. Royal projects redirected streams and raised massive embankments. The city survived because countless people performed small acts of repair within a system too large for any one person to see. Water linked the rice field to the palace. It linked the labour of villagers to the ambitions of kings. It linked the arrival of the monsoon to the survival of an urban population spread across hundreds of square kilometres. In successful years, the system must have seemed almost miraculous. Rain filled the reservoirs. Ponds rose beside the houses. Young rice plants stood in bright green fields. Fish moved through flooded areas. Boats carried people and goods along waterways. The great temples reflected in calm surfaces, their towers appearing twice, once in stone and once in water. This was the world Angkor had created, not a city that resisted nature, but a city that attempted to organise its power. Yet every new canal, reservoir, embankment and settlement added another connection to the network. The system became larger. More people depended upon it. More fields relied on familiar patterns of rain and drainage. More channels had to be cleared, repaired and adjusted. Complexity gave Angkor strength. It allowed the city to grow far beyond what the seasonal landscape might otherwise have supported. It helped sustain royal courts, religious institutions, craftsmen, armies, and a vast population living between temples and fields. But complexity also carried a hidden cost. A small village pond could be repaired by a few families. A vast network, stretching across an entire urban region, required coordination, labour, knowledge, and political stability. A blocked channel in one place could redirect water somewhere else. A damaged embankment could place pressure on another part of the system. A repair that solved one problem might create a new one downstream. As long as the climate remained within familiar limits, and as long as the kingdom could organise the people needed to maintain the network, the system endured. But Angkor was becoming dependent on more than water. It was becoming dependent on the ability to control water across an immense and increasingly complicated landscape. The larger that landscape became, the more difficult it would be to repair when something began to fail. And above this kingdom of fields, reservoirs and canals stood the rulers who claimed to maintain not only the order of the city, but the order of the cosmos itself. Above the reservoirs, fields and canals of Angkor stood the kings. From roughly the 9th century onward, generation after generation of Khmer rulers made this landscape the centre of their power. They built capitals, moved royal courts, raised temples, dug moats and reshaped the earth around them. Their authority was political, but it was also sacred. A Khmer king did not present himself simply as a ruler of people and territory. He stood at the meeting point between different worlds, between earth and heaven, between the kingdom and the divine, between the arrival of the rains and the survival of the fields. To govern was to maintain order. That order had to be visible. It appeared in processions, inscriptions, ceremonies, roads, bridges, and monuments whose scale seemed to exceed ordinary human life. Across Angkor, architecture transformed royal power into something permanent and physical. The great temple mountains rose above the surrounding plain. Their stepped towers represented Mount Meru, the sacred mountain believed to stand at the center of the universe. Around them, moats and reservoirs recalled the cosmic ocean. Causeways became symbolic paths from the human world toward the realm of the gods. A person approaching one of these temples did not simply enter a building. They moved through a model of the cosmos. The landscape itself became a declaration that the kingdom existed within a sacred order, and that the king stood near its center. No monument expressed this vision more powerfully than Angkor Wat. Built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II, the temple rose from the plain behind a vast moat and long stone causeway. Its 5 central towers formed the shape of a sacred mountain, while its galleries carried immense carved scenes of gods, battles, royal processions, and cosmic struggle. The monument was dedicated to Vishnu, but it was also inseparable from the authority of the king who ordered it. Every block of stone represented organization. Quarries had to be opened. Stone had to be cut, shaped, and transported across long distances. Workers had to be fed. Specialists had to understand geometry, drainage, sculpture, and construction. Canals and roads had to carry people and materials through the landscape. The temple's beauty concealed an enormous system of labor. More than a century later, another ruler reshaped Angkor on a similarly vast scale. Jayavarman VII came to power after a period of invasion and political crisis. Under his rule, the kingdom built Angkor Thom, a great walled city surrounded by a moat and entered through monumental gates. At its center stood the Bayon. Its towers carried enormous stone faces looking outward in several directions, calm and watchful above the movement of the city below. Their meaning is still debated, but their effect is unmistakable. They made royal and sacred presence part of the skyline itself. Jayavarman VII also sponsored roads, bridges, temples, rest houses, and hospitals across the kingdom. These projects connected the capital to distant regions and presented royal power as something that travelled through the land. A bridge did more than cross water. A road did more than carry people. Each structure drew the kingdom into a wider network centred on the authority of the king. Yet monuments did not maintain themselves. Stone weathered, roofs failed, channels filled with sediment, wooden structures decayed, bridges needed repair, embankments had to be strengthened, and temple communities required food, labour, and continuing support. The more Angkor built, the more future generations inherited. Every temple added another sacred institution. Every road added another route to maintain. Every reservoir and moat became part of a landscape that demanded attention long after the ruler who created it was gone. For centuries, this accumulation testified to the strength of the Khmer state. The monuments seemed to prove that the kingdom could command labour, organise resources, and impose order upon the world. But the same landscape also became increasingly expensive to preserve. A powerful king could begin a project in a single reign. Those who followed had to live with its demands for generations. Angkor's architecture therefore carried a quiet contradiction. The monuments made royal power appear eternal, but the system supporting them depended on people, harvests, roads, water, and political stability, things that were never eternal. and Angkor was never only a city of kings and temples. Between the monuments lived an urban population whose world was built largely from materials that would not survive. Before Angkor became a landscape of ruins, it was a place of ordinary mornings. At first light, mist rested over the rice fields. Water gathered in shallow pools beside raised paths, reflecting the pale sky. Smoke rose from cooking fires beneath the roofs of wooden houses, drifting between palms, gardens, and small household ponds. The city awakened gradually. Families carried water in jars from nearby ponds. Farmers walked toward the fields, with tools balanced across their shoulders. Fishermen checked traps in canals and flooded ground. Children moved through the settlements, while dogs wandered between houses raised above the damp earth. From a distance, the towers of the temple stood above everything. But for most people, daily life unfolded below them. The population of Angkor included far more than priests, officials, and members of the royal court. There were farmers who produced rice, vegetables, fruit and livestock. There were labourers who repaired roads, cleared channels, moved stone, and maintained embankments. There were potters shaping vessels from clay. Metalworkers produced tools, ornaments, weapons, and ritual objects. Woodcarvers created furniture, household items, and architectural decoration that would rarely survive the centuries. Stoneworkers carved images of gods, animals, flowers, warriors, and kings into the temples. In workshops near religious and administrative centres, specialists may have worked under the supervision of officials or temple communities. Elsewhere, crafts were produced within households and small settlements scattered across the landscape. Goods moved through Angkor from near and far. Salt, ceramics, metals, forest products, cloth and luxury objects passed along roads and waterways. Merchants arrived from other parts of the Khmer kingdom and from regions beyond it. Some brought practical goods needed for everyday life. Others carried rare materials that expressed status or served religious ceremonies. The city was connected to a wider world. Monks, pilgrims, officials, messengers, soldiers, and traders travelled along the raised roads. Processions crossed stone bridges lined with carved figures. Boats moved through channels where water levels allowed. At temple gates, visitors entered spaces filled with incense, chanting, offerings, and the sound of footsteps against stone. Yet Angkor did not resemble the dense cities familiar from other parts of the medieval world. It was not a continuous mass of stone buildings surrounded by a single defensive wall. Its urban landscape was dispersed. Neighbourhoods were separated by ponds, gardens, fields, shrines, canals, and open ground. Houses stood on wooden posts, often in small groups near water and agricultural land. Temples and administrative centres formed important nodes, but between them stretched a broad inhabited landscape. A traveller moving through Angkor may not always have known when one settlement ended and another began. The city blended into its surroundings. A road might pass from a temple district into a group of houses, then beside rice fields, then toward another shrine or reservoir. Trees grew close to homes. Livestock moved through open areas. Water, farmland, and habitation were woven together. This low-density form allowed Angkor to spread across an immense area. It also explains why so much of the city later became difficult to see. The monuments were built from stone because they were intended for gods, kings, and sacred institutions. Ordinary life was built from wood, bamboo, thatch, clay, and earth. These materials were practical and abundant, but they were not permanent. When a wooden house was abandoned, its roof collapsed. Termites and moisture weakened the posts. Vegetation covered the floor. Within generations, little might remain except a raised mound, a pond, fragments of pottery, or subtle changes in the soil. The same was true of markets, workshops, kitchens, animal pens, and local meeting places. The living city disappeared more quickly than the sacred city. This created an illusion. Later visitors saw temples standing alone in the forest and imagined that Angkor had been a ceremonial centre surrounded by emptiness. In reality, those temples had once risen above a populated landscape filled with movement, labour, conversation, smoke, animals, water, and crops. The stone structures were only the skeleton. The vanished wooden city had been the life around them. At Angkor's height, the entire landscape must have seemed deeply interconnected. Rice from the fields supported households, temples, workers, and officials. Roads carried people between centres of power. Ponds and canals supplied water. Religious institutions organised labour and received goods. Royal authority reached outward through inscriptions, monuments, and public works. For the people living there, this system may not have felt extraordinary. It was simply the world they had inherited. The monsoon arrived, the fields filled, the reservoirs held water, the temples received offerings. Children grew up beside ponds dug by earlier generations, and families repaired the same banks and paths year after year. Angkor appeared to have found a lasting balance between city, agriculture, religion, and climate. Its towers suggested permanence. Its reservoirs suggested control. Its roads and settlements suggested that the landscape itself had been brought into order. But permanence is often easiest to believe at the moment, just before conditions begin to change. The decline of Angkor did not begin with a burning palace or a final battle. It began more quietly. A canal that had once been cleared each season may have been left untouched for another year. Mud gathered along its edges. Plants took root in the shallow water. A small breach in an embankment was repaired with earth and timber, but not rebuilt as carefully as before. Elsewhere, water was redirected into a new channel. A pond beside a group of houses received less attention. Paths became overgrown. A settlement that had once been busy grew quieter as families moved toward another part of the landscape. No single change would have seemed important. Angkor had always required repair. Channels filled with silt, banks weakened, wooden bridges decayed. Water shifted its course after heavy rain. For centuries, communities and officials had responded by clearing, rebuilding, and adapting. But over time, the pattern began to change. Repairs became less complete. Some channels were abandoned while others were enlarged. Water moved through routes that had not been part of the original design. Sediment accumulated in places where it had once been regularly removed. In parts of the urban centre, activity appears to have declined gradually during the 14th century. The evidence is subtle. There are no written records announcing that a neighbourhood had been abandoned. Instead, archaeologists find changes in soil, pollen, charcoal, and plant remains. Land that had once been intensively used began to support more vegetation. Areas near major monuments became less densely occupied. The city was not empty. Angkor Wat remained important. Religious life continued. People still lived across the wider region, but some parts of the old urban system were no longer being used with the same intensity. This suggests that Angkor's transformation had begun before the famous military events later associated with the year 1431. The city was already changing. The changes were not only physical. For centuries, royal power had been expressed through enormous temple foundations, extensive land grants, and communities organized around sacred institutions. Temples received rice, labor, animals, precious objects, and the service of people assigned to maintain rituals and buildings. Over time, that system of support changed. New kings did not always build on the same scale as their predecessors. Some older temples received less royal attention. The relationship between the palace, religious institutions, and the population no longer worked exactly as it had during the great centuries of expansion. At the same time, Theravada Buddhism became increasingly important in Khmer society. Its spread did not destroy Angkor. It did not suddenly cause people to abandon the city or stop maintaining canals, but it helped reshape the religious world in which royal authority had once been presented. The monumental temple mountains of earlier kings had expressed a cosmic order centered on the ruler, the gods, and the sacred landscape. Theravada traditions placed greater emphasis on personal merit, monastic communities, and a path to liberation that did not depend on the same form of divine kingship. Religious life continued, but the meaning of power was changing. Some temples were adapted for new forms of worship. Sacred spaces were reused. Images and rituals took on different meanings. This was not the end of Khmer culture. It was evidence of a society reorganizing itself. The same was true of the city. A channel abandoned in one place might remain active elsewhere. A family might leave one settlement and establish another nearby. A temple could lose royal support yet continue to receive pilgrims. Angkor did not move from life to emptiness in a single step. It became uneven. Some districts remained important, others slowly faded. The vast network of roads, reservoirs, neighborhoods, and sacred centers no longer operated as one fully coordinated whole. The first cracks were therefore not dramatic. They were visible in reduced maintenance, shifting settlement, changing religious patronage, and the gradual weakening of old connections. These were signs of change, but they did not yet explain what had placed the system under such pressure. For generations, Angkor had lived by the rhythm of the monsoon. The dry months hardened the soil and lowered the ponds. Then the rains returned, filling channels, soaking the fields, and restoring the water on which the city depended. The cycle was never perfectly predictable. Some years were drier than others. Some storms arrived late. Some fields produced less rice. A society that had lived with the monsoon for centuries understood uncertainty. But in the 14th century, the pattern began to change in ways that were far more severe. The evidence for this change was not found in a royal inscription or carved on the wall of a temple. It was preserved inside trees. Each year, a tree adds a new layer of growth beneath its bark. In favourable years, when moisture is abundant, that layer may grow wider. In dry years, growth may slow, leaving a narrower ring. By studying these patterns, scientists can reconstruct parts of the climate experienced by the tree across centuries. The trees become silent records. Their rings preserve not the exact weather of every day, but the long rise and fall of moisture, drought, and recovery. Researchers studying old trees in mainland Southeast Asia found a striking pattern. During the 14th and early 15th centuries, the region experienced several prolonged periods of severe drought. These were not simply 1 or 2 weak monsoons. Some dry intervals lasted for years, while others extended across much longer periods of instability. The rains had become unreliable. For Angkor, the consequences would have spread through the landscape slowly at first. A reservoir might not fill completely. A household pond that once held water through the dry season might begin to shrink earlier. A canal designed to carry a familiar volume would run shallow. Rice fields planted in expectation of seasonal rain would become increasingly vulnerable. One poor harvest could be endured. Stored grain might help. A neighbouring district might produce more. The following monsoon might restore what had been lost. But repeated drought changed the problem. When dry years came one after another, reserves diminished. Households had less food to spare. Temple communities received less rice. Labourers who would normally repair roads, embankments, and channels had to spend more time protecting their own survival. The pressure moved upward through the entire system. Water for drinking became harder to secure in some places. Fish and other wetland resources declined. Fields that depended on carefully timed flooding became less productive. Trees and vegetation around settlements suffered. The city had been built around seasonal variation, but not around an extended failure of the seasonal pattern itself. The great reservoirs may have provided some protection. Local ponds and channels could store water and redistribute it. Communities may have deepened ponds, cleared blocked routes, strengthened embankments, or diverted water toward the most important areas. Officials and engineers likely tried to adapt. The Angkorian system was not passive. For centuries, it had been altered and repaired in response to changing needs. New channels were cut, old ones were modified, water was sent along different routes, but every adjustment had limits. A channel could move water only if water was available. A reservoir could store only what the monsoon supplied. A city, spread across such a vast landscape, could not protect every field, pond and settlement equally. The drought also exposed the social weaknesses already appearing within Angkor. A system of this size required cooperation. It needed local labour, technical knowledge, political authority, and a steady flow of resources. If neighbourhoods were becoming less populated, if royal support was changing, and if old institutions were weakening, then maintaining the network became more difficult at precisely the moment when maintenance mattered most. Drought did not destroy Angkor. That would be too simple. Cities do not usually fall because of one dry season or even one prolonged period of hardship. But drought placed extraordinary pressure on a system that had already become immense, interconnected, and difficult to maintain. It reduced the margin for error. It forced communities to make choices about which fields to protect, which channels to repair, and which settlements could still be supported. It weakened the ability of the city to recover from other shocks, and it made Angkor increasingly dependent on the return of the rains. For years, the sky remained uncertain. Reservoirs fell lower, ponds contracted, fields waited. Then the rain returned, but it did not return gently. After years of uncertain monsoons, the rain came back. At first, it may have seemed like relief. Clouds gathered over the plain. The air cooled. Water began to collect in ponds that had been shrinking for years. Channels that had carried only a thin flow started to fill again. But the return of rain did not restore the old balance. Some monsoons arrived with unusual force. Heavy storms fell across land, hardened by drought. Dry soil could not absorb the water easily. Vegetation weakened by repeated dry years offered less protection against erosion. Water moved quickly across fields, roads, embankments, and settlements. The same network that had once guided the monsoon now faced conditions beyond the range for which it had been designed. A canal bank weakened during drought could collapse under sudden pressure. A narrow channel could fill with sediment and force water toward a different route. An embankment repaired quickly in one season might fail in the next. At one point in the system, water overflowed. Farther downstream, another channel received more than it could carry. The damage did not remain isolated. Angkor's water network was highly connected. That connection had once been one of its greatest strengths. Reservoirs, canals, moats, embankments, and natural streams could support one another across a vast landscape. But in a tightly linked system, failure could also travel. When one route became blocked, water moved somewhere else. When one bank broke, pressure increased on the next. When a channel was widened to protect one district, another area might receive less water or more flooding. A repair made in one place could create a new problem somewhere downstream. This was not because the people of Angkor had forgotten how water worked. Their ancestors had altered the landscape for centuries. They understood drainage, storage, diversion, and seasonal flow. They had built one of the most remarkable hydraulic environments of the medieval world. But knowledge did not remove the limits of scale. The network had grown across generations. Older channels intersected with newer ones. Some routes had been redirected. Others had filled with sediment or become too shallow. Different parts of the system may no longer have responded to water in the same way. As rainfall became more extreme, the city needed more labour, more coordination, and more rapid repair. Yet Angkor was already under pressure. Some districts were less populated. Old systems of support were changing. Resources were becoming harder to organise. A network that had once expanded with the power of the kingdom now required that same level of power simply to remain stable. Evidence in the landscape suggests that major channels experience severe erosion. In some places, flowing water cut deeply into the ground, enlarging channels beyond their earlier form. Elsewhere, sediment accumulated, reducing the ability of water to pass through. The system was not simply damaged by drought. It was damaged by the movement between extremes. Too little water weakened the city. Then too much water struck the weakened network. The problem was not rain alone. It was the loss of predictability. Angkor had not simply been built beside water. It had been built around the expectation that water would continue to behave within familiar limits. The monsoon could vary, but the broad rhythm was expected to return. Reservoirs could fall, but they would refill. Channels could overflow, but they could be repaired. Fields could suffer, but another season would restore them. That expectation had supported centuries of planning. When the climate began shifting between prolonged drought and intense rainfall, the old assumptions no longer held. The city did not lose control of water in a single moment. It gradually lost the ability to keep adapting to extremes. This is the deeper meaning behind the failure of Angkor's hydraulic system. There was no final day when every canal broke. Some continued to function. Some were repaired. Some communities found new ways to manage local water. But the network as a whole became less reliable. It no longer offered the same protection against drought. It no longer distributed heavy rainfall with the same control. And as the system became harder to maintain, fewer people could depend on it with confidence. For a city spread across such a wide landscape, that loss of confidence mattered. A family deciding where to plant rice needed to trust that water would arrive. A temple community needed to trust that surrounding settlements could provide food. Officials needed to believe that labour could be gathered for repairs. Rulers needed to demonstrate that the landscape remained under control. When those expectations weakened, the crisis moved beyond engineering. It entered politics. It entered religion. It entered the decisions families made about whether to remain. Yet damaged canals and broken embankments still do not fully explain why Angkor was not rebuilt on the same scale. The Khmer kingdom had recovered from hardship before. It had survived invasion, political conflict, and changes in leadership. Why then did power gradually move away? Why did fewer people return to restore the old urban world? For that answer, we must look beyond the canals, to war, belief, and a changing economic world. The weakening of Angkor's water system did not happen in isolation. Beyond the reservoirs and canals, the political world of mainland Southeast Asia was also changing. To the west, the kingdom of Ayutthaya was growing in power. Founded in the 14th century, Ayutthaya occupied a strategic position in the river plains of what is now central Thailand. Its rulers controlled productive agricultural land, expanding trade routes, and armies capable of challenging neighbouring states. Conflict between the Khmer kingdom and Ayutthaya did not begin with one final invasion. It unfolded through repeated campaigns, shifting borders, contested territories, and periods of pressure that stretched across generations. Each conflict demanded resources. Soldiers had to be recruited and supplied. Roads and bridges carried armies rather than labourers assigned to public works. Rice that might have supported canal maintenance or temple communities was redirected toward military needs. Officials who once organised construction and repair were forced to respond to threats elsewhere. War did not have to destroy every canal to weaken the system. It only had to reduce the kingdom's ability to maintain them. The year 1431 is often presented as the moment Angkor fell, when forces from Ayutthaya captured the city. It remains an important historical marker, but it should not be imagined as a single switch that turned a thriving metropolis into an empty ruin. By that time, Angkor had already been changing for decades. Parts of the urban core were less intensively used. The hydraulic network was under pressure. Royal patronage had shifted. The climate had become unstable. The campaign of 1431 may have accelerated these changes, damaged political authority, and encouraged further movement away from the old capital. But it was not the beginning of decline, and it was not the end of every form of life at Angkor. The deeper transformation was a movement of power. The Khmer court increasingly turned southward, closer to the Mekong and Tonle Sap river systems. Rulers could connect more easily to expanding trade networks. Maritime commerce was becoming increasingly important across Southeast Asia, linking ports and river settlements to merchants from China, India, the Islamic world, and other regions. Angkor had been built around control of an inland agricultural landscape. The emerging economic world placed greater value on access to rivers, ports, and overseas trade. This did not make Angkor useless. Its temples remained sacred. Its fields and communities still had value. But the old capital was no longer the only place from which power could be organised. A court located farther south could participate more directly in trade, taxation, diplomacy, and the movement of goods along waterways leading toward the sea. As political attention shifted, the logic of maintaining Angkor changed. A vast inland city required enormous investment. Its canals had to be cleared, its roads needed repair, its reservoirs and embankments demanded coordinated labour. Its temples depended on continuing patronage. If the royal court, merchants, officials, and military resources were increasingly concentrated elsewhere, rebuilding Angkor on its former scale became less urgent. The city had not merely suffered damage, it was losing its position at the centre of the kingdom's future. Religious life was changing as well. For centuries, Khmer kings had expressed authority through monumental temple building and sacred systems closely connected to Hindu traditions and forms of Mahayana Buddhism. The Temple Mountain placed the ruler within a cosmic order. Royal power appeared in stone, ritual, and the organization of sacred communities. As Theravada Buddhism became more influential, the relationship between the ruler, the temple, and ordinary believers began to change. Theravada practice emphasized monastic communities, personal merit, moral conduct, and the individual path toward liberation. It did not require the same kind of monumental royal architecture to organize religious life. A village monastery could become important without a king constructing another vast temple mountain. Older sacred spaces were not simply rejected. Many were adapted, images were reinterpreted, new statues were installed. Rituals continued in altered forms. Angkor Wat itself remained a place of worship. This was not cultural decline, it was religious transformation. Yet the transformation reduced the importance of the old political model, in which royal authority was repeatedly renewed through enormous construction projects and elaborate temple institutions. The changes in climate, war, trade, and belief therefore reinforced one another. Climate placed pressure on the hydraulic network. A weaker network reduced the city's ability to endure drought and flood. War drew labour and resources away from repair. Political authority moved toward regions better connected to river and maritime trade. Religious change made the older pattern of sacred kingship and monumental patronage less central. Together, these forces altered the question facing Khmer rulers. It was no longer simply, how can Angkor be restored? It became, why should the kingdom continue investing in a vast and vulnerable inland capital when power, trade, and opportunity were moving elsewhere? The answer did not require a formal decision to abandon the city. It emerged through thousands of smaller choices. An official accepted a position farther south. A merchant followed a more active trade route. A monastic community received support in a new settlement. A labourer was no longer sent to repair an old embankment. A family moved closer to relatives who had already left. The centre of gravity shifted gradually. A capital does not need to be destroyed to cease being a capital. Sometimes it ends because people gradually choose to build their futures somewhere else. For one family living beside an Angkorian canal, the transformation may have felt something like this. The dry season lasts longer than expected. The pond beside the house falls lower each week. Mud cracks around its edges. The canal that once brought water near the fields carries only a shallow flow, and the family waits for rain that does not come. They have endured difficult years before. Older relatives remember poor harvests, damaged embankments, and seasons when rice had to be measured carefully. But this time, the uncertainty continues. When the rains finally arrive, they come too quickly. Water rushes through the weakened channel and breaks part of the bank. A section of the field floods, while another receives too little. The family joins its neighbours in repairing the damage with baskets of earth, timber, and woven mats. In earlier years, officials or organised work crews may have arrived to help restore larger sections of the system. Now fewer people come. Some have been called away by military demands. Others have moved to more active settlements. The labour available for repair is no longer what it once was. News travels along the road. There has been more fighting to the west. The court is spending longer periods in the south. Merchants speak of river settlements where trade is growing, where ships arrive with foreign goods, and where new opportunities can be found. A relative has already left. At first, he promised to return after one season. Then another message came, saying that work was available farther south and that the family should consider joining him. The decision is not simple. The house was built by their parents. The pond was dug by an earlier generation. Their fields lie beside land cultivated by people they have known all their lives. The nearby temple holds familiar images, memories, offerings, and the names of the dead. To leave would mean giving up more than property. It would mean stepping away from a landscape that had defined the shape of life. So the family waits. They repair the bank again. They plant another crop. They listen for news. Perhaps the following year is better. Perhaps the pond holds more water. Perhaps the nearby temple still attracts pilgrims, and a market continues to gather along the road. But the old confidence has weakened. One neighbour leaves, then another. A section of the canal is no longer cleared. A path becomes overgrown. The market meets less often. The distance between occupied houses slowly increases. Eventually, the family makes its choice. They do not flee beneath a burning sky. There is no army at the door. They gather tools, cooking vessels, cloth, seed, and a few sacred objects. They leave behind what is too heavy to carry. They close the house as if they may return. Perhaps they believe the move will be temporary. Perhaps it is. There was probably no single last night of Angkor. There were thousands of last nights, experienced by different families over many years. One household moved toward another district. Another followed relatives south. Some remained near temples that continued to receive worshippers. Others settled closer to rivers, trade routes, or more reliable land. The population did not vanish. It dispersed. This gradual movement is better understood not as the disappearance of a people, but as an urban diaspora. The city lost density. Labour, trade, political activity, and religious life became less concentrated in the old metropolitan centre. People carried their language, skills, beliefs, and memories into new communities. Behind them, the material city changed quickly. Wooden houses collapsed, thatched roofs rotted beneath the rain, termites weakened posts, gardens spread beyond their boundaries. Rice fields returned to reeds, grasses, and scrub, channels filled with sediment. Without regular clearing, water moved more slowly or found new paths. Small ponds became marshy, embankments softened beneath roots and weather. The temples endured longer because they had been built from stone. But even stone changed. Roots entered joints. Rain darkened walls. Trees rose beside galleries and towers. The inhabited landscape disappeared far more quickly than the sacred one, leaving later generations with monuments standing where neighbourhoods had once been. The process was uneven. Some areas declined early, others remained active. Angkor Wat continued to draw worshippers. Monastic communities adapted old spaces. Villages survived within the wider region. There was no clean boundary between occupation and abandonment. The royal city had changed beyond recognition, but Angkor itself had not become empty of meaning. The decline of Angkor was not the disappearance of the Khmer people. It was not the end of their language, their beliefs, or their connection to the land. The royal court moved, political power shifted. The great hydraulic network no longer operated as it once had. But the people who had built and sustained Angkor continued to live across Cambodia and the wider region. They carried their traditions into new settlements. They continued to farm, trade, worship, raise families, and speak the languages of their ancestors. Skills developed within the old capital survived in new forms. Religious practices changed, but they did not vanish. Stories, rituals, and memories continued to connect communities to the sacred landscape. Angkor Wat remained especially important. Even after the old capital lost its central political role, the temple did not become an empty shell. It continued to attract monks, pilgrims, local residents, and visitors from distant places. Its galleries were reused. New religious images were placed within older spaces. Offerings were made beneath towers originally built for another sacred tradition. By the 16th century, Angkor Wat was firmly revered as a Theravada Buddhist temple. The monument had changed in meaning, but not in importance. This continuity matters. It shows that Angkor did not pass cleanly from life into death. Sacred places were adapted, older symbols were given new interpretations. Communities preserved their relationship with the temples even as the political world around them changed. The same stone corridors that had once served royal ceremonies later sheltered Buddhist worship. The moat still held water. The towers still marked the horizon. The temple remained part of a living religious world. Across the wider landscape, people continued to inhabit villages, maintain shrines, use paths, and cultivate land near the ruins. Angkor was not simply an abandoned archaeological site waiting to be found. It remained a sacred and inhabited place. This is why the language of discovery must be used carefully. Foreign travellers saw the towers, explorers described the carvings, archaeologists measured walls, mapped canals, and revealed the hidden scale of the city. Modern technologies helped reconstruct the roads, reservoirs, neighbourhoods, and fields that had disappeared beneath forest and farmland. These discoveries transformed global understanding of Angkor. But they did not give Angkor meaning for the first time. The Khmer people did not need outsiders to tell them that the temples were important. Local communities had never lost all connection to the place. Monks had continued to pray there. Pilgrims had continued to visit. Stories had continued to surround the stones. What modern archaeology recovered was not the existence of Angkor, but the immense scale of the urban world that had once grown around it. The temples had remained visible. The city had become difficult to see. That distinction changes the story. Angkor was not a mysterious creation left behind by an unknown people. It was the work of Khmer rulers, labourers, farmers, craftsmen, monks, engineers, and families whose descendants still live in the region today. The ruins are not evidence of a vanished race. They are evidence of a society that changed its political centre, reorganised its religious life, and adapted to a different economic and environmental world. The great city did not survive in its old form. Its reservoirs no longer supported the same urban system. Its roads no longer carried royal processions across a unified capital. Its neighbourhoods thinned and disappeared, but the culture that created Angkor endured beyond the city. The fall of Angkor was not the disappearance of the Khmer people. It was the transformation of a particular urban, political, and hydraulic world. Tonight, the moon still rises over Angkor. Its light settles across the towers, crosses the long causeways, and rests upon the dark surface of the moat. Insects call from the trees, leaves move softly in the night air. The reflection of the temple trembles whenever the water is disturbed. Across the wider landscape, old channels still follow paths shaped by human hands. Some are narrow and quiet. Others have become part of fields, forests, and villages that continue to surround the monuments. The great reservoirs no longer support the same urban world, yet water still moves through a landscape that was transformed by generations of Khmer labour. Angkor began with ambition. Kings raised temples that represented the cosmos. Engineers redirected streams, built embankments, and linked reservoirs to a vast network of settlements. Farmers planted rice according to the rhythm of the monsoon. Families repaired ponds and canals. Workers carried stone, food, timber, and tools across the city. Water nourished Angkor. It supported fields, households, temples, and royal power. It allowed a dispersed urban landscape to grow across an extraordinary distance. The complexity of this system made the city strong. It also made the city difficult to protect when familiar conditions began to change. Long droughts reduced the water available to fields and communities. Powerful monsoons returned with destructive force. Channels eroded, embankments failed, repairs became harder to coordinate across a city already experiencing political and social change. At the same time, war placed pressure on the kingdom. Trade and political power moved south. Religious life took new forms. Families gradually built their futures elsewhere. The city did not end in a single moment. It thinned, shifted, and changed. Wooden homes disappeared. Fields returned to vegetation. Canals filled with sediment. Yet the temples endured, and so did the people who had given them meaning. Angkor Wat remained a place of worship. The Khmer language survived. Communities continued to live near the ancient landscape, carrying beliefs, memories, and traditions beyond the old royal capital. Civilizations are rarely held together by stone alone. They endure through countless systems: water, labor, belief, trust, and memory. When those systems change, people change with them. And beneath the quiet moon, the waters of Angkor continue to reflect a civilization that did not disappear, but learned to live beyond the city it had built.